Welcome to Relation Tales. Please like this video and subscribe Relation Tales. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, sipping his morning coffee as Amelia moved around the house, getting ready for her day. From the outside, it looked like any other morning for a married couple of 10 years. But inside, Ryan felt an uneasiness that had been gnawing at him for months. The routine that once felt comfortable now seemed stagnant, lifeless. Amelia was in front of the mirror, her movements careful and deliberate as she applied her makeup. She had always been beautiful, but lately there was a distance in her eyes, a distance Ryan couldn't ignore any longer. They had met when they were both in their mid-20s, full of dreams and ambitions. Ryan was a rising star in the tech industry, while Amelia worked in marketing. Their relationship had been passionate from the start. Late-night conversations about their future, spontaneous road trips, and a shared love for adventure. But as the years went by, life had settled into a comfortable routine. Ryan's career took off, and he became more focused on his work. Amelia, on the other hand, found herself feeling more and more unfulfilled. The excitement that had once defined their relationship seemed to have faded, replaced by predictability and monotony. In the past year, Amelia had started going out more, meeting new people through work events and social gatherings. Ryan had always trusted her, never questioning her need for independence. But lately, things felt different. She was going out more frequently, and when she was home, she seemed distracted, distant. Ryan's phone buzzed on the table, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a message from one of his colleagues, reminding him of an upcoming meeting. He sighed, placing the phone back down and taking another sip of coffee. He didn't want to go to work today. He wanted to sit down with Amelia, talk to her, and figure out what was going on. But he knew that conversation wouldn't happen, not today at least. As Amelia finished applying her makeup, she glanced at Ryan through the mirror, her expression unreadable. "I'm going out with some friends tonight," she said, her tone casual, as if she was informing him about any other routine event. But Ryan could feel the weight of those words. Something was off. Again, he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He didn't want to come off as accusatory, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a casual night out. Amelia paused, her hand stilling on the makeup brush. "Yes, it's just a small gathering. I'll be back later tonight." Ryan nodded, forcing a smile, but inside his mind raced with questions. Who were these friends? Why hadn't he met them? Why was she going out so often without him? He wanted to ask, but he didn't. Instead, he stood up, placing his empty coffee cup in the sink. "I'll see you later, then," he said, his voice tinged with a hint of resignation. He grabbed his briefcase and headed for the door, pausing for a moment as he turned back to look at Amelia. She was already lost in her own world, focused on her reflection in the mirror. As Ryan stepped outside, the crisp morning air hit him, and he took a deep breath. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something that would shatter the carefully constructed life they had built together. It was a Friday morning, like many others in Ryan and Amelia's life together, yet something about it felt different. The unease that Ryan had been carrying for months seemed to manifest all at once as he sat on the sofa, watching Amelia prepare for her day. She moved with a kind of excitement, her hands working carefully as she applied makeup. She wore a new dress, one Ryan hadn't seen before, hugging her body perfectly as if she had been waiting for an occasion to show it off. Ryan's throat tightened as the scene before him unfolded. He wanted to say something, but didn't know where to start. How did you ask someone why they seemed so distant without sounding paranoid? How did you tell someone that the trust you once shared felt fragile, like glass teetering on the edge of a table? Amelia was engrossed in her routine, and for a moment, Ryan saw her as if she were someone else, someone he didn't know. He had always admired how effortlessly beautiful she was, but now, as she stood before the mirror, it was like looking at a stranger. The suddenness of the moment hit him. He couldn't stay silent anymore. "Where are you going?" Ryan asked, his voice betraying the calmness he tried to maintain. Amelia froze, her hand hovering above her face, brush in hand. She met his eyes through the mirror, her own expression unreadable. "I didn't have a chance to tell you. I'm going out of town with some new friends," she said quietly, the words slipping out as though she had rehearsed them. Ryan blinked, feeling the weight of her sentence. Out of town? How long will you be gone? His mind raced with questions. Friends? Since when did she have friends he didn't know about? 3 days, she said, now fully facing him. Her eyes avoided his, glancing briefly at the floor before returning to the mirror, as if her reflection offered more comfort than his gaze. Ryan felt his stomach tighten. He stood up from the sofa, the tension between them now palpable. 3 days? His voice carried more disbelief than he had intended. Why didn't you mention this before? Amelia sighed softly, almost as if she were frustrated by the situation. It was a last-minute thing, Ryan. I didn't think it was a big deal. I need a break. Time to meet new people. To relax. She waved her hand in the air, as if dismissing his concerns entirely. Ryan's hands clenched into fists by his sides. So, I'm not important enough for you to tell me about your plans? You just leave without saying a word. Amelia turned slowly, facing him now, her expression defensive. It's not about that. I didn't think it would matter this much. You're always busy, wrapped up in your own world, so I figured it wouldn't hurt to take a few days for myself. The accusation stung. Ryan's jaw clenched as he searched for the right words. He knew he'd been absorbed in work, but this wasn't about him. This was about the distance that had grown between them, an invisible barrier that had been building for months. Amelia, if you walk out that door right now without explaining anything to me, we're going to be in serious trouble, Ryan said, his voice low but resolute. There was no going back after this conversation. Amelia paused, her hand on the doorknob. She hesitated, a moment of silence hanging heavily between them. Ryan saw her shoulders tense, and for a brief second, he thought she might turn around, might offer an explanation that made sense. But instead, she exhaled softly. I need this, Ryan. I need space. I'll explain everything when I get back. Without looking at him, she opened the door and walked out. The sound of the door closing behind her was like a death knell. Ryan stood frozen in place, staring at the empty space where Amelia had stood moments before. His mind was racing, his heart pounding, but all he could feel was an overwhelming numbness. How had they gotten to this point? How had he missed all the signs? Ryan sank down onto the sofa, his hands resting on his knees as he stared blankly ahead. The house around him felt cold and unfamiliar, as though the life he had known for the last 10 years had just slipped through his fingers. As Amelia walked down the street, the cool morning air brushed against her skin, but it did little to calm her nerves. Her mind raced as she tried to shake the guilt that had settled in her chest. She had tried to avoid this confrontation for weeks, knowing deep down that Ryan deserved answers. But how could she tell him the truth? How could she explain the gnawing feeling inside her that something was missing, that the life they had built together was no longer enough? It wasn't that Ryan was a bad husband. In many ways, he was perfect. He worked hard, provided for them, and never complained. But that was just it. Their life had become too predictable, too comfortable. The passion they once shared had faded into routine, and Amelia felt trapped in the monotony. She had met Mark at a work event months ago. At first, it was innocent, just casual conversations about their jobs, shared laughs over mundane topics. But soon, the conversations grew deeper, and the attraction between them became undeniable. Mark was everything Ryan wasn't: spontaneous, adventurous, and full of energy. Being with him made Amelia feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. But it wasn't just about the thrill. With Mark, Amelia didn't feel like she had to be anyone other than herself. There were no expectations, no obligations. It was easy, and for once, she wasn't weighed down by the pressures of married life. As she walked towards the car waiting to take her to Mark, Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she couldn't stop herself. The thought of going back to her quiet life with Ryan, pretending everything was fine, was suffocating. For 3 days, she would be free. Free to be whoever she wanted to be. Free to feel something other than the boredom that had consumed her for so long. But in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered a warning, a voice she tried to ignore. What if, when she returned, everything had changed? What if Ryan didn't forgive her? What if she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed? Amelia pushed the thoughts away as she reached the car and climbed inside. She couldn't think about that now. For the next 3 days, she was leaving her old life behind. Whatever happened after that, she would deal with later. Inside the house, Ryan sat in silence, his thoughts spiraling as the hours passed. He replayed the conversation over and over in his mind, trying to make sense of it all. The woman he had loved for 10 years had just walked out, and he had no idea if she would ever come back the same. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the floor. Ryan stared at the divorce lawyer's card sitting on the table in front of him. He had kept it there for weeks, not wanting to acknowledge the possibility that he might need it. Now, though, the reality of his situation was becoming clearer with every passing minute. If Amelia didn't come back, or if she did, and nothing had changed, Ryan knew what he had to do. Ryan sat on the sofa, trying to calm the storm inside his mind, but the silence of the house only amplified the chaos. For hours, he replayed the morning's events, but no matter how much he tried to rationalize it, the sinking feeling of betrayal gnawed at his heart. He couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to Amelia's sudden trip than just meeting new friends. The seed of doubt had been planted, and it was starting to grow rapidly, filling his thoughts with unsettling possibilities. It wasn't that Amelia had never gone out without him before. Over the years, she had her own social life, friends, and hobbies. But the way she had acted this morning, the avoidance, the defensiveness, it wasn't like her. Or maybe it was, and Ryan had simply been blind to it all this time. He looked down at his phone, contemplating whether to reach out to her. The thought of calling felt pointless. What would she say? Another vague excuse? She had left, after all, with no intention of explaining herself until she returned. That was what hurt the most, being left in the dark, her silence louder than any words could have been. Unable to shake his unease, Ryan opened his laptop. It was a desperate move, but one driven by the need for answers. He logged into their shared cell phone account, something he had never done before because he respected Amelia's privacy. But today, respect had taken a back seat to suspicion. His hands trembled slightly as he navigated through the account history, scanning through her recent call logs and text messages. What he found sent a jolt through his body. There were multiple calls and texts to a number he didn't recognize, all clustered over the past few weeks. The frequency was alarming. Late-night texts, long phone calls during times she had claimed to be at work or with friends. His heart raced as he clicked into the text history, scanning the messages. Many were vague, seemingly harmless. But then, a single message appeared, glaring on the screen like a neon sign in a dark room. "I can't wait to see you this weekend." 3 days alone together, finally. Ryan's stomach dropped, his vision blurring as he stared at the screen. The message was from just 2 days ago, and it was from a man named Mark. He felt like the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His worst fears were confirmed. Amelia was having an affair. His mind swirled with emotions. Anger, disbelief, sadness, but most of all, betrayal. How long had this been going on? How could he have been so blind? He had trusted her, given her space when she needed it. And in return, she had been lying to him. For weeks, maybe months, while he had been working late to provide for their future, she had been meeting another man behind his back. The initial shock soon morphed into a cold, simmering rage. Ryan had never considered himself a vengeful person, but now the desire for revenge burned deep inside him. He had given Amelia everything, his love, his loyalty, 10 years of his life. And she had thrown it all away for someone else. The phone in his hand felt heavy, a tool that had just shattered his entire reality. He debated calling Amelia, confronting her, but he knew she wouldn't tell him the truth. Not yet. He needed to gather more information to understand just how deep her betrayal ran. The next day, Ryan found himself outside a small cafe downtown. The same cafe where Amelia had told him she often met her friends. He sat in his car, eyes scanning the entrance, waiting. It was a risk, but he needed to know if she was really with Mark, if she had been lying about everything. Hours passed, and just as Ryan was about to give up, he saw her. Amelia stepped out of the cafe, laughing, her arm linked with a man Ryan had never seen before. Tall, well-dressed, with a confident swagger. Mark, the man she had been texting, the man she was spending the weekend with. Ryan's heart pounded as he watched them walk down the street, oblivious to his presence. They looked comfortable together, too comfortable. Mark's hand rested on the small of her back as they talked, and Amelia smiled in a way Ryan hadn't seen in years. Something inside him snapped. Ryan wasn't going to let this go. He wasn't going to sit by and watch as his wife threw away their marriage for someone else. If Amelia wanted to break the vows they had made, then so be it. But there would be consequences. Over the next few days, Ryan formulated a plan. It was simple but effective. Amelia had left him no choice but to seek revenge, to take back control of a situation that had spiraled beyond his grasp. The idea of confronting her outright seemed pointless. She had already made her decision. But he could still turn the tables. He could still make her feel the same sense of betrayal and hurt that she had inflicted on him. The first step was financial. Ryan had always handled the majority of their finances, so it was easy to start making subtle changes. He began moving funds out of their joint account, transferring them to his own private savings. He canceled several of her credit cards, knowing it would leave her scrambling when she tried to use them. Next, he gathered every piece of evidence he had of her infidelity: the text messages, phone records, and the pictures he had discreetly taken of her with Mark. It was enough to present a solid case for divorce. Ryan wasn't going to drag this out. He wanted it over as soon as possible, and he wanted to come out on top. The final step was emotional. Ryan knew that confronting Amelia directly would give her the upper hand. She would try to explain, to downplay what had happened, to manipulate the situation. He wouldn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, he would make her confront the reality of her actions in the coldest way possible. When Amelia returned home 3 days later, she was greeted by an empty house. All of Ryan's belongings were gone. The closet was half empty, his side of the bed stripped bare. The kitchen was spotless, save for a single piece of paper sitting on the counter. Amelia frowned, her heart pounding as she reached for the note, dread creeping into her chest. It was a letter from Ryan, short but devastating. Amelia, I know. I've known for a while now. Don't bother trying to explain yourself. I've already spoken to a lawyer, and the divorce papers are on their way. You'll find that your access to our accounts has been restricted. It's only fair, considering you've spent the last few months betraying me. I'm leaving. I deserve better, and you know it. Good luck with Mark. I hope he was worth it. Ryan. Amelia's hands shook as she read the letter, her heart sinking with every word. She dropped the note, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she frantically looked around the empty house. Ryan was gone. He had found out about her affair and left. And now, she was alone. For a moment, she considered calling him, begging him to come back, but she knew it was too late. She had made her choice, and now she had to live with the consequences. The weight of her decisions crashed down on her, and for the first time in months, Amelia felt the full force of her guilt. She had destroyed her marriage, and there was no going back. For Ryan, the days that followed his departure were a blur of emotions. There was relief, yes, a sense of freedom he hadn't felt in years. But there was also sadness, an inescapable ache that came from the realization that the life he had built with Amelia was truly over. He had loved her once, deeply, and part of him still did. But the betrayal had severed something inside him, something that could never be repaired. Now, he had to figure out how to move forward, how to rebuild his life without her. Ryan rented a small apartment on the other side of town, far enough from the memories of their shared life. He threw himself into work, using the long hours to distract himself from the emptiness he felt. But even as he tried to move on, the bitterness lingered. Amelia had chosen someone else, someone she barely knew, over the 10 years they had spent together. It was a wound that would take time to heal. One night, while sitting alone in his apartment, Ryan received a message from an unknown number. He hesitated before opening it, already knowing who it was. Ryan, I'm so sorry. Please, let's talk. I made a mistake. The message was followed by a string of others, each one more desperate than the last. Amelia had realized her mistake, but for Ryan, it was too late. The trust had been shattered, and there was no going back. He blocked the number without responding, knowing that any conversation with her would only open old wounds. Ryan wasn't interested in revenge anymore. He wasn't interested in making her suffer. He just wanted to move on. And as the weeks turned into months, he slowly started to do just that. 6 months had passed since Ryan had walked out of the house for the last time. The divorce was finalized quickly, and Ryan had managed to rebuild his life, piece by piece. He had thrown himself into his work, taken up new hobbies, and even started dating again. But the pain of betrayal, while no longer sharp, was still there, lingering like a dull ache. It would take time for the scars to fade completely, but Ryan had learned one thing. He was stronger than he had ever realized. He had survived the worst kind of betrayal, and he had come out the other side. As Ryan stood on the balcony of his new apartment, looking out over the city, he felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and while the wounds were still healing, he knew that he was ready for whatever came next. Ryan had learned a lot in the months following his divorce. The healing process wasn't linear. There were days when he felt invincible and others when the weight of loneliness threatened to pull him under. But each passing day was another step forward, another piece of himself reclaimed from the wreckage of his old life. His new apartment, though small, had become a sanctuary. Every corner of it was filled with reminders that he had made it through. His own choice of furniture, photos of new memories with old friends, and small reminders of the man he was becoming. It was quiet, but it was his. The freedom that came with living alone, without the constant anxiety of what was happening behind his back, was a relief he hadn't known he needed. One evening, Ryan found himself scrolling through an old list of hobbies he'd abandoned over the years. Before he met Amelia, he'd been passionate about painting. It had been his way of expressing himself, of creating something beautiful out of nothing. But over time, life got in the way: work, marriage, the demands of a relationship. Somewhere along the line, he put the paintbrush down and never picked it back up. Tonight, that would change. He pulled out an old canvas from the back of his closet, setting it up in the middle of the living room. He didn't know what he was going to paint yet, but that didn't matter. What mattered was starting again. Slowly, the strokes began to form. Messy at first, uncoordinated, but soon they started to take shape. It wasn't about perfection. It was about the act of creating, of putting something of himself onto the canvas. Hours passed, and by the time he stepped back to look at his work, Ryan felt a sense of calm wash over him. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was his. It represented the journey he'd been on, the chaos, the pain, the healing. And as he stared at the finished painting, he realized that this was the first time in months he'd felt truly at peace. Meanwhile, on Amelia's side, life hadn't been as kind to Amelia after the divorce. She had thought she would find happiness in her new relationship with Mark, that it would be the fresh start she desperately needed. But the reality had been far less romantic than she had imagined. The thrill of the affair had quickly worn off, replaced by the harsh truth that Mark wasn't the man she thought he was. The excitement of sneaking around had blinded her to his flaws, and now, in the cold light of day, those flaws were impossible to ignore. Mark had become distant. What had once been a whirlwind romance full of passion and adventure had turned into a relationship built on lies and convenience. He wasn't interested in building a future with her, nor did he have any real intention of committing. Amelia found herself in a situation she never thought she'd be in, alone and without the safety net of her marriage. The loneliness hit her harder than she expected. She missed Ryan, not just for the comfort and stability he provided, but for the way he had always been there for her. In hindsight, she realized that the life they had built together wasn't so bad after all. Sure, things had gotten dull at times, but that was normal. Every relationship went through phases. She had been foolish to think that chasing excitement with Mark would solve her problems. One night, after another argument with Mark, Amelia sat alone in her apartment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought about reaching out to Ryan again, but the thought of what she had done to him stopped her. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. There was no going back. Back to Ryan? As the months continued to pass, Ryan's life slowly began to take on new meaning. He reconnected with old friends, some of whom he hadn't spoken to in years. It felt good to be surrounded by people who knew him before everything had fallen apart. They had been there for him through the darkest days, and now they were there to celebrate his return to himself. One of those friends was Lisa. someone he had known since high school. They hadn't been particularly close over the years, but when Ryan re-entered the social scene, they started talking more. At first, it was casual, meeting for coffee, catching up on life. But over time, something deeper began to develop between them. Lisa was kind, understanding, and most importantly, patient. She knew what Ryan had been through and never pushed him to move faster than he was ready. Their relationship blossomed slowly, in a way that felt natural and unforced. Unlike his relationship with Amelia, there was no rush, no pressure to make things perfect. With Lisa, he felt safe to be himself, flaws and all. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city skyline, Lisa turned to Ryan and said something that stuck with him. "You're stronger than you think," she said softly, her hand resting on his. "You've been through hell, but you're still here. And that says a lot about who you are." Ryan smiled, squeezing her hand. He didn't feel strong most of the time, but hearing those words from someone he trusted made a difference. Lisa wasn't just a new chapter in his life. She was a reminder that there was life after betrayal, that happiness was still possible even after everything had fallen apart. Amelia's regret. As Ryan moved forward with his life, Amelia continued to spiral. Mark had finally left her, moving on to someone else without so much as a second thought. She was left to pick up the pieces of her own mistakes. Every time she thought about reaching out to Ryan, guilt held her back. She knew she had no right to ask for forgiveness, not after everything she had done. But regret gnawed at her. She had thrown away a decade of her life with Ryan for something fleeting, something that wasn't worth the destruction it caused. Now, she was alone, with nothing but the memories of what she had lost. One day, in a moment of weakness, Amelia found herself standing outside Ryan's apartment building. She hadn't planned on coming here, but something had pulled her in this direction. She stared up at the windows, wondering if he was inside, if he had moved on, if he even thought about her anymore. She didn't have the courage to go in, to knock on his door. Instead, she stood there for a while, lost in her thoughts. Eventually, she turned and walked away, knowing deep down that it was too late for her to fix what she had broken. The day Amelia showed up outside Ryan's apartment was the same day he had decided to let go of the last remnants of their shared past. He didn't know she had been there. He never saw her standing on the street, staring up at his window. But in a way, it didn't matter. That chapter of his life was closed, and there was no room for her in the new life he was building. Later that evening, Ryan sat down at his desk, pulling out an old photo album. It was the one he and Amelia had put together over the years, filled with memories of their relationship. As he flipped through the pages, he felt a mixture of sadness and nostalgia. There had been good times, plenty of them, but those times were gone, and he wasn't going to dwell on what could have been anymore. He pulled out a pair of scissors and carefully began cutting the photos. Not out of anger, but out of a sense of closure. Each snip of the scissors was a step toward his new life, a final goodbye to the past. When he was done, Ryan took the pieces of the photos and placed them in a small box. He wasn't going to burn them or throw them away. They were still part of his history, after all. But they no longer had a place in his present or his future. The future beckons. As Ryan's life continued to evolve, he found himself at peace with the way things had turned out. He didn't know where his relationship with Lisa would go, but he wasn't worried about that. For the first time in a long time, he was content with simply living in the moment. One afternoon, while walking through the park with Lisa, Ryan stopped and took a deep breath. The air felt crisp, the sun warm on his skin. He looked over at Lisa, who was laughing at something he had said, and felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. The past was behind him, but the future was full of possibilities. And for the first time in a long time, Ryan was excited to see where it would take him. As the one-year mark of his divorce approached, Ryan reflected on the journey he had been through. It hadn't been easy, but it had taught him more about himself than he ever thought possible. He had learned the importance of self-worth, of setting boundaries, and of recognizing when to let go. The betrayal he had experienced had been devastating, but it hadn't broken him. If anything, it had made him stronger. He had learned that forgiveness wasn't always about absolving the other person. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of anger and resentment. Ryan had forgiven Amelia, not for her sake, but for his own. He didn't hold on to the bitterness anymore because it no longer served him. He had moved on, and that was enough. As he stood on the balcony of his apartment, looking out at the city below, Ryan felt a sense of calm settle over him. The future was wide open, full of possibilities. He didn't know what was next, but he was ready to embrace whatever came his way. Because if there was one thing he had learned over the past year, it was that he was resilient. He had survived the storm, and now it was time to enjoy the sunshine.